Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC, and this is our In the News, our dive into the news stories that have been making the headlines over this past couple of weeks. We do this quite regularly, but before we go any further, this is a landmark episode of the podcast. This is the 200th episode of the Independence podcast, and John Stevens has brought in a cake.
I didn't even know it was the birthday, so I'm really sorry I've missed the event.
I'm wondering what 200th is. So if silver is 25 and what's golden 50, what's 200?
All I know is if you've listened to all 200, that's been more than 100 hours of your life by my maths, so that you have listened to the Independence podcast. If you've been with us all the way through,
what if you've recorded more than 200?
We salute you. With me to talk about the news is Adrian Reynolds, our head of National Ministries. Hello, Adrian.
Hello, Phil.
And our National Director, John Stevens. Good morning to you, John.
Hi, Phil.
And chaps, it's the eve of the conference where we'll be travelling up this weekend, so really excited to spend some time together at our Leaders Conference in Blackpool.
And it's fair to say we're all quite busy.
Yes.
So we're excited to record the news, obviously, but yes, it's all systems go. If you're listening to this before Monday, the 4th of November, we'll have been very busy travelling up, setting up. We're really excited. 1,100 people coming to the conference, and just a great opportunity to serve one another, to meet one another, to connect, to be engaged, to be equipped, but especially actually to look to Jesus. That's what we're going to be doing, and that's the primary number one qualification for leadership, or that the way that we are sustained in leadership is we keep our eyes fixed on our Good Shepherd. So really excited about that.
And a special shout out to you if you are listening to this as you travel to Blackpool. Imagine that. I like to think people are. So okay. There we are.
You think that, Phil?
But seriously, we're really looking forward to it. So yeah, safe travels if you're joining us in Blackpool. We look forward to being with you next week. A couple of news stories just to pick up on from kind of the Christian world, or the impact Christians particularly, that we just want to touch upon. The first one's about abortion buffer zones, John. So this has come into force in England and Wales. This is you cannot protest 150 metres outside an abortion clinic in the way that you could before. And that's been launched this week in England and Wales. Any comment you want to make on that, John, in terms of what that looks like?
It's been coming for some time. It was already the position in sort of Northern Ireland and Scotland. And actually they could give or issue orders about specific abortion clinics if they were being protested against. So at one level, people have known this is coming for quite a long time. The desire is to prevent people being intimidated when they're sort of going to an abortion clinic. And,
are they being, though?
Well, actually, I mean, there are some records of some pretty appalling behaviour on the part of some people who have been protesting outside abortion clinics. So yes, in some instances, there are reports of women being spat on and various other things being done. So at one level, government has felt that it's had to intervene here. And actually, protest is controlled in a whole variety of ways. Obviously, there was a recent case of a man who was convicted of conducting silent prayer outside an abortion clinic. Under the new law, that was under a very specific order in Bournemouth, but under the new law, the CPS has made clear that silent praying outside the abortion clinic isn't protected, nor is standing holding a Bible. All of those things can be seen as being potentially intimidating.
So how do we view that as Christians? Because that seems extreme to me.
At one level, the police have said they won't automatically prosecute those things. So the gentleman who was prosecuted, he was asked to move on and he refused to move on, and the prosecution followed from the refusal really to move on. I mean, I think from a Christian perspective, we're called to obey the law. It seems to me that it's a question, are we in conscience required to protest within 150 metres of abortion clinics? That's a question of conscience Christians will have to work through. Of course, we still have the right to protest. We still have the right to campaign with MPs. We still have the right to pray at home. Lots of churches are doing lots of work establishing crises pregnancy advisory services. Though in some ways, those are probably a far more effective way of helping women not to seek abortions than campaigning outside abortion clinics. So I think in reality, it will have a relatively limited impact. At the same time, it feels like an infringement on freedom. But at the same time, we've also got to balance the rights of different people within society.
Another story that's been doing the rounds this week, Adrian, relates to the Archbishop of Canterbury and comments he's made about same-sex marriage. It seems to me he said something along the lines of we've come to the conclusion that whenever there's sexual expression, it must be in a committed relationship, whether that's heterosexual or homosexual. I was disappointed to hear that personally.
Yeah, although I don't think, standing back from all that's gone on, and it's easy to get immersed in the detail of this because of all the legislation and the complexity within the Church of England. But if you stand back, I don't think it's overly surprising, his trajectory. And actually, interestingly, I read his statement before I listened to the podcast where he was interviewed by Alistair Campbell. And I didn't know what he was saying in the statement. It seemed so waffly, I couldn't quite work it out. But clearly, if you put the two together, he is announcing essentially that he's changed his mind on gay sex. And I think it is disappointing. There's obviously been a backlash within the Anglican communion. GAFCON have rebuked him. The Conservative group have rebuked him just this morning. I saw that in the news. So I think, I feel for brothers and sisters who are ministering in the Church of England. It's a very, very difficult position when your leader, your worldwide leader, essentially announces that he's abandoning an orthodox position. But I think it's less surprising, perhaps, in the overall sweep than perhaps we might think just by looking at that one instance.
It's very common. I think actually one of the lessons from this is you can have doctrinal positions, but if you don't enforce them, in the end, there will be drift from them. And at one level, the Archbishop of Canterbury has changed his position, but actually that attitude towards gay relationships has been tolerated within the Anglican Church for decades, with clergy in gay relationships or supporting gay relationships, bishops in that position, deans of cathedrals in that position. So at one level, the Anglican position has not been upheld in practice in the churches for a very long period of time. And at one level, I think that's just a reminder, a mere confessional position is never enough to basically protect. You have to be prepared to actually carry it into effect. I think that's actually one of the strengths of FIEC, that we require all of our churches every year to reconfirm their commitment to the doctrinal basis and to reconfirm their commitment to our sort of policy positions, which includes sort of on sort of a marriage and sort of sex for heterosexual marriage relationships. And that's just really important. It makes people ask the question every year, do we still believe that this is what the Bible teaches, and are we going to abide by that? And if people can't, well, independency, they're free to leave. That's, their freedom is to go. But I think that's a really important discipline.
It's always when I'm chatting to churches about joining FIEC, I always make that point. You can't join FIEC, then drift into a position that strays from orthodoxy, because we're asking you every year that you still believe the same things you did 12 months previously. So, I absolutely agree with that.
Sad, though.
It is sad. Yeah. It is sad. Let's move.
So we should pray and remember to pray for our brothers and sisters in the Church of England who are fighting for orthodoxy, and they are beleaguered,
fighting.
And there's a lot of courage involved in that. And I think we just need to pray that the truth would prevail.
Thanks, John. Wise words. Let's talk a bit about another news story this week. Big news story. It's still dominating the papers as we record this morning on Friday, and that's the budget. So the first budget for the new Labour government. They've announced 40 billion in monies that will be raised from this budget in terms of tax rises and other ways of raising funds. It's quite interesting because they trailed this significantly, didn't they, beforehand? I think there's some interesting lessons there.
There weren't many surprises.
How do you kind of trail bad news insofar as people were looking at this thinking this is going to be bad, and then when Rachel Reeves was on her feet, it was, is this as bad as everybody was expecting it to be? And that's quite interesting. So there's been mixed reaction to it. What are your thoughts, and what can we learn from this?
You're going to go first, or shall I?
You go first.
The Labour government and its first budget. The first budget by a woman chancellor.
Yes, worth noting that.
It's significant at lots of different levels. I mean, the government were actually censured, weren't they, by the Speaker for basically releasing all the details of the budget before it happened.
But that's always happened.
Well, it has always happened, but it wasn't overly... I don't think the actual day was overly surprising. It's difficult to read budgets because it rather depends on your political point of view and where you're coming from. So, how you feel. So I've got a son-in-law who's very interested in farming, absolutely aghast at inheritance tax. Increases being put on farming land and agricultural land as a massive thing.
That seems to be one of the most controversial things in it, doesn't it?
It does, and it's the one that was least well trailed as well. So there's a thing that actually, if you want people to hear bad news, if you sort of drip feed it first of all, then it does slightly lessen the blow. I mean, I do feel for any government that's presenting a budget, they're trying to present a package of measures that will tackle the nation's finances. And I think whichever part of the political spectrum you're on, it's fair to say that it's acknowledged the nation's finances are not in good shape. We're reaping the benefit really of or the effect of all the money that was paid out during COVID, and probably rightly so. But that makes money tight, and yet we've got systems and processes that are in crisis, whether that's education or defence or the NHS, whatever it may be. So actually, it's a very, very difficult task. And I think I want to keep remembering that this is the nation's budget, not individuals' budget. So what I think quickly happens about budgets is it quickly becomes about what does it mean for me? And we can talk a bit about that in just a moment. What does it mean for churches? What does it mean for individuals? What's the pound in my pocket going to be worth? How many pounds are there going to be in my pocket? All that kind of stuff. So, the number of articles that there are, what does this mean for you? I find slightly depressing, because I think actually what Rachel Reeves is trying to do, and any previous chancellor is trying to do, is essentially balance the nation's books, finance the nation, and keep the nation on its feet. And inevitably that involves an element of personal cost and personal benefit to individuals. But actually, I think we need to keep the big picture. It's very, very easy for it to become about me, which is a reflection, I think, of our individualism. And I find this in church life as well. I think all the time people are thinking about what does it mean for me. So if you propose a change in church, it doesn't need to be financial, but you propose a change in church. We're going to go from one service to two services, for example. Immediately, people generally think, what does it mean? What does that mean for me?
Yeah.
What's the effect going to be on me?
Default position.
It's a default position, and of course that needs to be part of the process of discernment and thinking. But actually, we're not very good at thinking, what does it mean for us? What serves us? And I think I've seen that with the budget. So yeah, sorry, that's my little rant. Nothing to do with the budget really, but just I think we do need to stand back.
But there's an important principle there, isn't there? Yeah. How does this serve the whole rather than just me personally?
I think that is important.
It's a good principle. Yeah. John.
Well, I think the budget represents a massive shift in government policy in the way that things are being done. Clearly, what's happening is much more money is being put into public services, the NHS, education, other areas. So it was a huge tax raising budget, primarily for investment into those kind of areas. Some might say, well, this is actually facing the reality of where we are as a nation, that for too long there's been a trying to have your cake and eat it. And actually there's been a need to invest in those areas. So it is a shift that is kind of much more a Labour way of dealing with the economy. And that's being paid for by greater borrowing, but also very big tax rises, particularly taxing on employment. So I think the big money-raising element is the national insurance contributions on employers, which will go up. And I suspect that a lot of people, particularly lower and middle-income people, will be thinking, actually, this hasn't impacted me very much. It's nowhere near as bad as I thought. If you were on the minimum wage, that's been significantly increased. If you're in a kind of a lower income bracket, your kids aren't at private school, you're not a farmer, it's probably not going to impact massively on you individually. So for an awful lot of people, they will feel this hasn't particularly impacted on them, and others are sort of paying. I do think the big thing that remains to be seen is what the impact is of that very significant taxation on jobs. Because the government on the one hand was saying, Keir Starmer was saying, Rachel Reeves was saying, our priority is growth, growth, growth. Actually, all of the forecasts, including from the official forecasters, say that the effect of this will be to actually constrain growth, and there won't be as much growth. So if you tax employment, then maybe you reduce growth. So what's your overall objective? So I think that's the reason why the budget is being criticised. And I think part of this, and maybe there's a lesson in this, one of the challenges is that the reason why it's been done in this way is because in the manifesto, the parties said what they thought people wanted to hear, which is either we're not going to increase tax or we're not going to increase tax in particular ways. So the government has kept its promise. It's not increased income tax, national insurance on employees or VAT. That stayed the same, but that inevitably means they've had to tax elsewhere. Now, the question of which of those various taxing options raises money without constraining growth is a big debate. But having promised not to do that, effectively, they had very limited sort of choices that they could make as to where money could be raised. So
let's think about churches in a moment. Before I do that, one thing that I think is interesting, you mentioned the minimum wage. We were working it out, weren't we, after the budget on Wednesday. That means if you work a 40-hour week, the minimum wage is now going to be more than $25,000 a year, which is great. I would just say, I think churches need to look at that and see what they're paying their employed staff, because actually we need to make sure that we're doing right by the people that we employ in our churches. That would be my pitch.
Well made. Well made.
So let's talk about the national insurance rise for employers, because obviously a lot of churches are employers. FIEC is an employer. What's this going to mean as you understand it for
Worth
churches?
saying, by the way, that if you have one member of staff and you think of them as an office holder, for tax purposes, you're still an employer. So ministers of religion who have very archaic and their own set of rules, if they're office holders, are counted for tax purposes as employees. So even if you have just one person who's an office holder, you'll still be paying national insurance. So what does it mean for us? I think actually it's quite significant. So national insurance for employers has gone up 1.2%. There's some changes to thresholds and various other things, but that looks like it could add 1.2% to your salary bill in your church if you've got one member of staff or a team, whatever it may be. But there is something called employment allowance, which church treasurers should know about. And this has been in place for some time, which is that for a small business or a charity, which includes most churches, the first £5,000 of national insurance you can claim back. You don't get it automatically, you have to claim it back. So churches should be doing that anyway. And actually, I talked to a church treasurer yesterday who didn't know that and has missed out on £5,000 for the last few years. You can backdate it 4 years.
Okay.
So we'll put the link in the show notes.
So that could be 20 grand.
You could have 20 grand waiting for you. Well, it's unlikely your national insurance bill won't be that high, but yes, you could have 20 grand. So in terms of your national insurance going forward, the government have increased that. They've doubled it from, it was actually £5,250. I think it's now going to be £10,500. So that means that most churches will find that their national insurance increase is offset. You'd have to be a huge church with 50 staff really for it to work the other way. So we're a typical church, mid-range church. We've got one full-time employee, 2 part-time employees. We'll be about £1,500 better off as a result. So yes, do look into that and make sure your treasurer has looked into that. I mean, that's an allowance that's given to us. It would be stupid not to use it. So most churches will find themselves better off. There will be 1 or 2 churches or churches connected with Christian schools in the UK, very, very few, but there will be some, and maybe some people listening. And one of the other proposals that was confirmed in the budget is that VAT will be levied on private school fees, and that will impact you.
John, can I ask a kind of question, advice for church leaders when you're thinking about money? When money's tight, how are you best thinking about the decisions that you make? Because churches will always find finances are tight in various ways. What advice would you give to church leaders thinking about where best to put their resources as they look at their own kind of in-out budgets?
It's a massive question, isn't it?
I know, I'm sorry.
You have to ask the question, what's causing budgets to be tight? So that might be the church is trying to expand, the church is trying to do more. It might be impact of factors outside of the control of the church. So at one level, it's very specific for what might be causing challenges in the church. I mean, in the recent period, the cost of living crisis has meant maybe that the capacity of giving of individual Christians has gone down, and churches have had to, in a sense, be careful in terms of their budgets. I think several things that are really important. One, we have to trust God. In that he is able to provide what is needed for the ministry. So we mustn't sort of separate out money from spirituality, our recognition that, God has the cattle on 1,000 hills, and as members, we're called to be generous in our giving. So we have to preach and teach about money and put it in its right and proper perspective.
I mean, Jesus taught about money all the time, didn't he, in his public ministry?
And not just Jesus, but you look at the New Testament letters, and money is a key application in many of them, particularly encouragement to those who are wealthy to be generous in their giving. And I think we have to recognize that for many Christians in world terms, they are immensely wealthy and enjoy lifestyles that are kind of almost unparalleled in human history. So that is part of the dimension. So not to place burdens on those for whom it shouldn't be the case that they're giving more. The Bible recognizes you've got to give in accordance with what you have. So we mustn't be guilt-tripping people. We mustn't be commanding people in a legalistic way, but there is a right and proper way for encouraging people to be generous. I think in our planning, there is a sort of a right way for being cautious in our financial plans, that actually, in advance, as we think about things, to be realistic about what we can achieve, what people might be able to sort of give. So leadership shouldn't overextend. Everybody can want to push further and do more. And sometimes there can be a naivety about doing that. So I think very careful planning, knowing your congregation, communicating with them what it is you're planning on doing. I guess that's an advantage often of a church that has a slightly more congregational element to that. You have to carry people with you. You have to tell them what your plans are. You have to lay them out for them to be able to question on them. And that's a good discipline to be involved in, I think.
You really do trail it before the church meeting. Yeah, absolutely.
One further thought, which is this month, you may not know this, Phil, is National Will Writing Month.
Okay.
You can get your will written for free if you don't already have one. I think one of the things we don't really talk about in church, whereas lots of charities do, is legacies. Lots of church buildings and lots of church staff appointments actually have, in history, have been funded by legacies and people leaving money. The generation who are dying now and approaching the years of death, and I'm on the cusp of that, I guess, as we start to get older. They are the richest generation there have ever been in this country
in terms of assets,
and have huge money to leave, and often would just leave that to children, perhaps. But I think we should be encouraging people. Again, we've got to do this carefully and in an appropriate way, and perhaps we can help. We don't know. We've not really thought about it. They ought to be encouraged to consider leaving money to the church, which is tax efficient, by the way, because it's free of inheritance tax if your church is a charity, which it should be. And if you leave a certain proportion of your estate to charity, you also reduce your inheritance tax on any other part if you've got a large asset like a house. So yes, I think we should be encouraging people to think about legacies. That seems a very difficult and awkward thing to do. If you thought about leaving money to church in your will, who's going to stand up in front of church and say that? But actually, if we're going to talk about money, we ought to include that in. I think that is an important way, actually, that churches historically have been financed. And FIEC has benefited from that as well.
Just before you come in, John, I think Ray Evans wrote an article for us about that.
Did he?
So we could link that in the show notes if it's still online. Yeah.
I think my other key principle I urge people to bear in mind is actually do what is right by your employees and those who work for you. I think that there's a danger that churches can take the people for granted, and if money is tight, they think instantly about cutting the people or not caring for people in quite the way. Pay people proper salaries, enable people's income to keep
so
up
even
with,
if that means
inflation.
You have less staff.
Absolutely. And particularly people ahead of buildings. I think in many churches, actually people will give very generously to a building project. They'll give very generously to things that are improving the building. And the staff are expected to kind of live on sort of low salaries, and they're not necessarily provided for. I think biblically, people ahead of premises, the worker deserves their wages.
Absolutely.
Actually, you don't lose out in ministry by properly paying for and supporting those who are giving themselves to the work of ministry.
Excellent. Let's cross the pond. This time, yes, you've got your American baseball hat on.
Listeners can't see.
They cannot.
It's not a baseball hat.
Well, whatever. It looks. That's the style. It's the style.
Okay.
It is a baseball cap. By its style.
You Philistine.
Sorry. But anyway, we're crossing the pond because on Tuesday, while we're at the Leaders' Conference, we will have a new US president, Kamala Harris.
Well, maybe.
Or Donald Trump.
So interestingly, last time round, I am wearing my NFL hat, to be clear, and it's a Philadelphia Eagles hat, which is
the wrong shape,
because Philadelphia in Pennsylvania last year took 4 or 5 days to declare.
Last time, 4 years ago.
So actually, in theory, in the middle of the Leaders' Conference, we'll have a new US president declared, but in practice, it may take longer than that. Court cases and difficulties, and I mean, it is a remarkable situation, isn't it? I mean, I'm glad I'm not voting in the US because you see, Christians in many ways seem to be caught between a rock and a hard place. It seems to me, in terms of character and policies and all the sorts of things that we've reflected on in UK elections, just seem to be multiplied and exaggerated in the US election. So I think it's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of people who have to vote. Extraordinarily, actually, very few votes make a difference in the States. So the way that the electoral college system works, it's not just a popular vote like it is, for example, in France for a president. It doesn't quite work that way. You vote in state, and then your state has a certain number of votes. But the number of votes that are given in a state are 100%. So if the Democrats win in Pennsylvania, for example, by 50, they get 50.5%. They get all the votes in the electoral college.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Because the president doesn't always win the popular vote.
No, quite. And we've got to remind ourselves that although democracy is, I think, a good form of government on the whole, it's not perfect wherever it is. It has flaws wherever it is, and so we need to not idolize democracy as being supreme. No, it's not. It's a good form of government, probably the best form of government, but it has its flaws. So yes, it does mean, come next week, actually, the election could be decided by 100,000 voters, which seems extraordinary in a country that's so large.
No, 300 million.
But we ought to be praying. I think we ought to recognise that. Obviously, for Christians and people in America, this is a very important vote. But we need to recognise as well that America is a world leader. It's a world leader militarily. It's a world leader not only politically, but economically. And so actually what happens in the States has a huge impact. But I think we also just need to remember that although there may be a new president next year, there will not be a new king of the universe.
Absolutely. God is still sovereign, John, despite what happens on Tuesday in the States.
Yeah, absolutely. And God is sovereign over what happens
Indeed.
in the States on Tuesday. We have to have sort of confidence in that for whatever purposes he will raise up who he chooses through the mechanisms of the electoral process to lead America at this particular time. And in many ways, the American system, it looks very monarchical, actually electing this president figure who seems to have all power, but that power is constrained in all sorts of ways within the American Constitution, with the kind of a state level government. It's a much more complex picture. This is not somebody who is given a sense of dictatorial power. And again, one of the American limits of the Constitution is you are only in office for 4 years.
Yeah.
So almost as soon as
and
somebody,
2 terms.
Yeah, you can't do more than 8.
almost as soon as somebody wins, people start talking about the next election and what's going to happen next. And those are constraints on what is able to be done.
Yeah. Is it 2 consecutive terms or just 2 terms in total?
2 terms in total, I think.
Yeah. So go Eagles, by the way.
Yeah.
They're 5 and 2
good.
for the season, Phil, because I know you're interested in that. And let's pray for the US elections.
As I said before, the ball is the wrong shape. So let's talk about something back on this side of the pond. This is the infinite monkey theorem. Have you come across this before? So this is something that's trotted out to say to basically back up evolution. To say if you put chimps in front of typewriters and they randomly bashed keys, eventually they would write the complete works of Shakespeare. That's what's always been
How long would it take
out.
them to write Sally Rooney's?
Well,
less time than the complete works of Shakespeare.
No comment. But what's interesting is mathematicians in Australia have debunked this theorem. So they basically make
what
the
a
point,
good use of time that was.
So they basically said if every chimp bashed keys at random, there's a 5% chance one chimp somewhere would be able in its lifetime to type the word bananas. But it's very unlikely there would ever be enough time in the rest of human history for a chimp to get anywhere near the complete
That is
works
worrying
of
for Shakespeare, because I'm not aware that the word bananas appears in Shakespeare.
But I think what's fascinating is it does debunk this kind of evolutionary myth that actually if you just let things carry on like that, eventually these things would happen and monkeys would be able to type out the complete works of Shakespeare. I think that's fascinating. And listen to this. This is the quote that's come from the Australian mathematicians. It is not plausible that even with improved typing speeds or higher chimp populations that monkey labour will ever be viable for developing anything other than non-trivial works. So there we are. Excellent.
Well, I don't know the nature of the actual research itself, but
I'm sure it's thorough, John. Thorough.
It seems to me that if you have an infinite amount of time and an infinite number of monkeys, then probably you can say that it would come. I mean, the nature of infinity means that is. But even that itself.
I thought you did a law degree, not a maths degree. It's quite
I
exciting.
I think even that itself demonstrates how utterly implausible it is, given that we know, or scientifically, even on sort of majority scientific views, there's a limited period of time and there is not an infinite period of time. And actually it's been known for a long time, the idea that the universe and life evolved merely by chance is vanishingly small as a matter of probability. I can't remember, was it Fred Hoyle who said it was the equivalent of a wind blowing through a scrapyard and basically producing a 747 jet at the end of the process. I mean, actually the complexity of DNA and even the most basic kind of single cell life form is so great that it is vanishingly small, the possibility that might have happened. And the evolutionists will say, we agree that it's vanishingly small, but it happened.
Yeah.
And at one level, in a sense, they don't even buy into the premise. The fact that it's here is to them evidence that it happened, even if it is vanishingly small.
I think also, Phil, just to be a bit more serious, can I be serious about this story?
Of course you can.
People do believe tropes if they satisfy their desire for the thing that it's trying to prove. On a completely different subject, someone was saying to me this week about conversion therapy, which is something that's coming up and we'll be talking about perhaps more and reflecting on at another stage. And actually the practices that are outlawed, the practices that are already outlawed are generally what people believe on the street when you talk about conversion therapy. So you stop a man in the street or woman in the street, say, should conversion therapy be outlawed? And they're thinking about electrocution. So of course it should. And so that is read as, I'm in favour of a ban on conversion therapy, whereas in fact those practices are already outlawed. So it's very easy, I think, to manipulate what people think about things, and the kind of just the standard sort of phrases and stock accounts that people, of course we're against conversion therapy. And I think this is another example of that. It's just a very handy little it's a trope, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I was watching kind of Brian Cox has done a sort of a new series on the solar system, looking at what's going on, and he kind of, looks at the different planets. He was talking about volcanism in the episode that I was watching. Extraordinary sort of volcanic activity on Venus and on volcanic.
Oh, I see.
I thought you said volcanism.
I was thinking live long and prosper. I thought you were,
But and then he sort of looks at Earth and what's here, and he sort of ends up almost saying, "Isn't it extraordinary? All of these things happening in the universe. It happens to be here on this planet that the conditions are perfectly in balance for life. How could that be?" I kind of think,
dear Brian.
And actually, in the end, the idea that there is a creator God who has designed things and that life is the intended purpose of it makes far, far more sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One final question, brothers, before we go. Collins Dictionary have announced their word of the year. It is brat.
Yes, I know that.
Is FIEC, or indeed this podcast, brat, would you say? Can I define it for you? So if something is brat,
I know what it is. You just have to define it for John, if you like.
So it's something that is confident, independent, then less helpfully follows a hedonistic lifestyle.
No. I rather thought of the words that have been added to the Collins Dictionary, supermajority is one of them. I thought that might have got in, but there we are.
No, there we are.
There's a new BBC series, a comedy series about inventing words that you didn't know you needed. And the word that I heard that I thought was just great is the word influencer.
Binfluencer.
Absolutely. It's kind of, in charge of rubbish and refuse.
No, that is the first person who puts the bins out every week in your neighbourhood.
Okay.
I just rely on the neighbours. Which bin is it this week? Look out the window, see what other people have put out. They have binfluenced me to put out the recycling. There we are. Very good. Brothers, time has beaten us. We've not quite got to the bottom of whether or not FIEC is brat, but there we are.
I think we know it's not.
Okay, good. Thank you. We are independent, and we're just the middle one, not the first or the last. There we are. Excellent. Adrian, sorry to have ruined the ending of the podcast for you there, brother. Forgive me. Do enjoy coming up to Blackpool if you're joining us there. We look forward to seeing you next week. And thanks for joining us on Independence, the FIEC podcast. Do rate, leave a review so others can find it, and we'll talk to you again.
See you on episode 201.
You will. This has been episode 200. Thanks for listening or watching.